Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leader series, Real-Time Monitoring and Control of Water Systems. My name is Megan Purdy and I'll be your host for today. Firstly, in keeping with our custom, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures, and to elders, past, present, emerging. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that today's webinar has been hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, Queensland University of Technology, QUT. QUT is an ambitious institution with a growing research output focused on technology and innovation. QUT ranks in the world's top 200 universities. Our strategic plan establishes QUT as the university for the real world and charts our provision of transformative education and research that is relevant to our communities. With more than 50,000 students across 2 inner-city campuses in Brisbane, QUT offers academic programs in fields spanning business, creative industries, education, engineering, health, law, science and social justice. I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Professor David McCarthy. Helping Australia keep its urban river and water systems healthy is the underlying objective of David at the QUT School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. At the top of his agenda is the need to tackle pollution to ensure stormwater is safe for reuse and discharge to downstream recreational water bodies. Professor McCarthy has authored numerous publications, including articles in journals and book chapters. He is most known for his research in the fields of urban hydrology, stormwater management, sensor networks, and wastewater treatment. Please join me in welcoming Professor David McCarthy.
Hi, and thanks very much, Megan, for the introduction. I appreciate it very much, and welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy my talk today on real-time monitoring and control of stormwater systems. I thought it might be useful to begin with a little bit of my research interests. My research area is urban water management, with specialised skills in understanding pathogen fate and transport in environmental systems, biosurveillance of pathogens, including novel sampling and assay methods, health-related water microbiology and human health risk assessments, methods to predict human health, including green treatment technologies, and finally, sensing and modelling of biophysical human systems to understand and reduce risks. And I suppose a lot of my talk today will be on that last point. Before I begin my presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the other fantastic people who have been helping with all of this research over the last couple of decades. These are all my students and staff members and all the collaborators that I've been working with. So I appreciate you all very much and I acknowledge their contributions to this presentation. So today, I think you should expect 3 topics. One on sensor development, where we develop sensors for real-time monitoring of urban water systems. One on sensor army, a bit of an application of the sensors that we've developed to detect illegal cross connections into the stormwater system from the wastewater system. And the last topic will be on real-time control of stormwater systems, where we use these sensors to control stormwater treatment systems in real time. So first off, sensors. So our little team, Bossel, began in 2012, and we've been developing sensors since then. There's many sensors that exist out there, so lots of sensors. Our aim was not to recreate any of the same, but our aim was to really focus on some of the issues that we've been finding over the last 15 plus years of monitoring environmental systems. Some of these included things like loggers. Loggers that logged to the cloud were really costly. They were complicated and confusing for field staff to actually program and install. And rarely was there any available that could do everything in one. They were also often quite high power, meaning that you'd have to change the battery quite often. Sensors that were available, they were often high cost, and that kind of high cost prohibits collecting spatially distributed data sets. There's a high maintenance frequency for many of these sensors, which also increases costs because you have to have people going out there to maintain them, and also increased risks because you have to have people driving on dangerous roads and also getting into water systems to maintain these systems. So risks were also increasing. Often our experience, and it might not be everyone's, but our experience was that the simple sensors worked really well. Things that were measuring like temperature of the water and electric conductivity of the water, these were really working well, but more complicated parameters like ammonia often were only offered at high costs and had high degrees of disappointment, meaning that often these sensors were broken when we got back out to the field, or that they stopped working properly in between the maintenance periods. Finally, all of the sensors that we were using were commercially locked in technologies, and they weren't very accessible to all walks of life. So in 2015, as I mentioned, we developed this small little team called Bossil, where we were focusing on trying to combat some of these issues that we were observing in the water industry. During this process, we developed our first set of data logs and loggers and communications equipment, helped immensely by a gentleman called Stephen Katsamis. We developed a low-cost logging system that was all-in-one, could take many types of different inputs into the logging system. It was low cost, had an SD card for recording, it had a real-time clock, it had 3G, 4G, 2G even, NB-IoT technologies for low bandwidth transmission to the cloud, and had very low battery consumption. We also developed other Bossil sensors for people to do DIY experiments at home or in the office. And finally, we've created what we call the Bossil Nano, which is a small footprint of our Bossil logger, doing all of the same things, but in a much smaller footprint, just the size of my pinky finger, my index finger. Along with the idea that water sensing in a contact sense is difficult, we developed what we call the non-contact radar sensor for measuring both depth and velocity from outside of the water column. You can see in the top right-hand corner of this slide a velocity sensor. This is a low-cost velocity sensor that we designed to go inside a creek or a stormwater drain. And these devices need regular cleaning. They will foul up with sediments, they will also clog up with biofilm, and so you need to get into the drain or the creek and clean them out manually every couple of months. Our ambition is to kind of do this, what we call non-contact sensing, the ability to sit outside of the water column and be able to sense parameters like depth and velocity from outside of the system. That enables us to have much reduced maintenance frequencies and much reduced installation costs, because it avoids us from getting in contact with the water. So this little device, which was developed by Stephen, is a little radar sensor, much like a radar that would be used to catch you speeding. And the device is very low cost and is all in a 3D printed housing, all available online for free to download if you want to do it yourself, or you can buy it from us. We tested it in the laboratory and it worked quite well. We've got a published paper on this now, very nice. And we also have many installations around Victoria. This is just an example installation that we have here. It's in a stormwater pipe. And as you can see, the device sits on top of the water column or outside of the water column and is easily installed without getting into the system itself. And it has much lower maintenance requirements because it's not in contact with that harsh environment of urban stormwater. We've also had some applications in wastewater that we're going to begin to explore. Another idea of this non-contact sensing is to use imagery, so using actual cameras to take pictures of the water to understand what's happening. For example, detecting of blockages, sensors, sediment buildup, litter, fatbergs, and foam production. This little guy, we found out that there was not many 3G, 4G sensors that are available on the market, so we actually developed one ourselves. This is it here. You can see it's a very small footprint, and it's also low cost, about $120. We've used it to monitor a wetland. We're using it currently to monitor some biofilters and also some stormwater systems for pollution detection. And some other colleagues have used other cameras, low-cost cameras around the world to monitor waste buildup or litter buildup and fatberg buildup in pumping stations of sewage treatment plants. And it's being used quite readily and with some good performance coupled with some AI detection technologies. Eric has been working, another student of ours has been working on this concept of hyperspectral sensing. Many of you might know of hyperspectral sensors being used in satellites and also on aircraft to detect, for example, algal blooms within our water systems. This concept is similar, but it sits very much closer to the water column. We're thinking about 1 meter to 2 meters away from the water column. So they really are like a low-cost sensor that sits close to the waterway. These hyperspectral sensors send out lots of different wavelengths to a particular waterway and then detects the response. And we can use that response to determine roughly what kind of quality of water is flowing past. And so in this particular example, on this plot on the left-hand side there, you can see Eric has correlated turbidity levels with normalized responsivity of this particular sensor. And you can see the relationship's quite good. So again, here, what we can do is avoid contact with the water to reduce those maintenance frequencies and risks. Another gentleman by the name of Stephen has been working on this concept of a particle size distribution sensor, where we use a camera to actually physically measure particle sizes within the actual waterway. And while this is only still in prototype form, we're very confident this will work. The aim is to develop a real-time sensor that sits within the waterway to develop, to test particle size distribution. I mentioned earlier that we've had lots of experience with ammonia sensors and lots of difficulties in measuring ammonia. We've had a student called Mehran who has been working with simple colorimetric tests to measure ammonia. And we have started to test these. They're working very well on real-world samples. See the correlation plot there on the left-hand side of predicted ammonia versus actual ammonia concentrations, using very simple detection methods. At the moment, we're actually building a device that will sit within the waterway and sample every 15 minutes and get a reading every 15 minutes for a 2-week period continuously. So we're hoping to disrupt the market in this space and actually allow people to make their own sensors and install them themselves, or again, you can buy them from our team. Mehran is also working on a concept called a biosensor. It's based on a microbial fuel cell. It has an anode and a cathode and basically a membrane in between. And all you do is measure the voltage drop across those two anodes, electrodes. This is a 3D printed version of Mehran's super duper biosensor. And he's been getting some really nice correlations between the voltage drop across those electrodes and nitrate levels within water samples. Christelle and Yetian have been working a lot with what we call passive samplers. A passive sampler, for those who don't know, are materials that we dip into the water and allow targets to associate with it over time. And the idea here is that we deploy it. We then go back and collect that material after 1 day or perhaps even a week. And then we analyze that sample for the particular analyte that we're interested in. The benefit of passive sampling is that it's a continuous exposure technique. So it's much better than a spot or grab sample, which only gives you a very quick snapshot of what's happening over a day. We developed this, what we call a torpedo. Other people have dubbed it the torpedo because we used it heavily for tracking wastewater and the SARS-CoV-2 concentrations in wastewater. It's open source and open hardware, meaning that it's actually been deployed around 20 countries at last count. We've manufactured about 55,000 of them at Monash and now have been used over 30,000 around the world, which is quite amazing. It's featured in lots of different articles and policy documents. And we've been using it successfully to trace SARS-CoV-2 infection rates across years. We've got other applications, though. We've been using it in stormwater to detect illicit discharges into stormwater systems from sewage. We've been using it to potentially detect Japanese encephalitis virus in environmental systems. We've heard that it's been used in Netherlands to detect monkeypox in wastewater. And we've also begun exploring the use of it to detect AMR, antimicrobial resistance genes in environmental systems. On to the last technology that I wanted to mention today. This gentleman here, Miao Wang, has dedicated some of his PhD to developing a MAD autosampler. It's an in-stream autosampler that sits in the water column itself, collects samples over time, and stores those samples in the tube, which holds the sampler in place. It's in a 3D printed housing. It's super low cost. It's very small. It's open source and open hardware, and you can remotely trigger this system to take samples over time. We've tested this in quite harsh environments like inlets of sewage treatment plants and compared it to traditional Huck autosamplers. You can see there on the right-hand side figure, the Huck autosampler. We've compared them using for SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater. On the y-axis there is the MADAS results, and on the x-axis is the traditional Huck autosampler. As you can see, the results there are quite promising, suggesting that our little autosampler can do the same as a beautiful Huck machine. We're also working on what we call the MADAS discrete sampler. It takes discrete samples over a deployment period and enables us to understand dynamics across a particular system. So on to a little bit more about what we can do with these sensors. And this gentleman here, Luke Shee, is a postdoctoral research fellow at Monash University. And we've been working quite a lot with him about using, and he's been developing what he called the next generation sensor army network. And in this particular concept, he uses a diverse deployment of sensors in a particular catchment that uploads quite frequently to a cloud database. That cloud database does online adjustments and that data is then used to run through an alarm system to determine when we should send alarms to crews to go and inspect unusual dry weather flow patterns. So the case study here today, we've got lots of case studies if you're interested, but one that we've been working with Melbourne Water on is the Dandenong Creek case study, where we've been trying to understand industry pollution into Old Joe's Creek. There's a website here if you're interested in going to it. We deployed 25 sensors. This was a depth, temperature, and electric conductivity sensor or salinity sensor. We coupled that with our Bossel board that we developed and a low-cost battery. We deployed them using simple techniques that allowed us to do this without getting into the pipe. That reduces risks quite significantly. And we deployed them across 25 locations in a catchment. We could click on any of these points at any given time to understand dynamics of depth, electric conductivity, and temperature. This is just a zoom in of all the different locations that we went to. The red crosses represent the industrial catchments that we monitored and each site where we had a sensor, and the stars were the residential catchments. We had a simple anomaly detection algorithm that first went through and eliminated wet weather events. We were only really interested in dry weather periods and where dry weather inputs were coming into the system illegally. We had a simple machine learning system that went through and analyzed depth, EC, and temperature and used that to determine when things went a bit awry. Then we applied that for over a year of data. This is all the data that we've got out of this project. I'm just going to focus on the top left-hand blot here for a second. Each of these pink bars represents a particular site. The residential on the right-hand side of the dashed blue line there. And it just represents the number of unusual discharge events that occurred per year. And I'm going to focus on two here, IND05 and IND13. And these represent 355 unusual events per year and 338 unusual events per year. So very high frequency discharges that we couldn't really explain that were happening during dry weather, almost one per day. If we look into a little bit more detail into each of these sites, we can have a look at what the patterns of those discharges are. This heat map here basically represents when these discharges occurred. So the darker the color, the more chances that the discharge occurred on that day and in that particular hour of that day. So you can see the red box here represents Monday to Friday, 6 to 6, so 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And as you can see at this particular site, most of the unusual events were occurring in the normal working hours. And so that meant if you were going out there and doing the traditional method of identifying dry weather flow, which is to open up a pit, look in, is there flow? No, there's not, put it down and go to the next site. At this particular site, you would have a very good chance of detecting that unusual flow pattern. However, let's look at the other catchment that had very high number of pulses per year. This was roughly about one per day as well of the year. You can see that these unusual dry weather pulses were not happening at all during normal 6 to 6. Monday to Friday. But most importantly, they were occurring very early in the morning or very late at night, suggesting that that usual pit lifting method was not going to be possible to detect these unusual discharges. We've been deploying the Sensor Army framework around multiple other catchments around Australia with quite nice success stories. If you're interested in any of these, then please let us know. We can have a chat about what those applications are. Okay, on to the last topic of today is around real-time control of stormwater treatment systems. In particular, we'll be focusing on biofilters and wetlands. If you don't know, biofilters and wetlands are stormwater treatment systems. They operate, and they've got plants in them, they operate what we call passively, meaning that when it rains on our urban catchments, water runs off those urban catchments, goes into these biofilters or wetlands, and then with gravity, those biofilters and wetlands slowly drain that water away and treat that water so that we can release it into the downstream ecosystem a little bit cleaner than what was going to be released if there was no treatment. The key word there is passive, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So in many parts of Australia over the last couple of decades, all of us have experienced some form of drought and heat, stress on our water systems. It meant that urban stormwater was treated more like a resource rather than a nuisance. And indeed, people have begun looking at whether we can harvest all of this wasted stormwater, perhaps treat it, trap the microbial pathogens that are of most concern and risky for people when they reuse it, trap them in these treatment systems, hopefully inactivate them or kill them, and then reuse that water, maybe not for drinking, but perhaps for toilet flushing or garden irrigation. So we set out to monitor some of these existing treatment systems and with the objective to see how each of these treatment systems were performing in pathogen removal or microbial removal. We started out with wetlands, and this lady, Mia Zeng, went out and monitored for 2 microbes, and she monitored for this one called E. coli and another one called Campylobacter. E. coli was always above that dashed line, which meant that it was always positively removed, meaning the inlet concentrations were always higher than the outlet concentrations. That's what we want. Unfortunately, what she found for Campylobacter was the opposite. 50% of the time, some of the outlet concentrations were in fact higher than what was going in. That meant Campylobacter was actually being produced in the wetland. Very interesting things. If you're interested in why, come and talk to me or ask the question. Gayani Chandrasena did the same thing in biofilters, and she saw the same effect. Sometimes these microbes were very well removed, and sometimes they were very poorly removed. And in fact, we had net leaching, or a negative removal rate, meaning they were being produced within the biofilter. So we embarked on a 15-year journey to optimize these stormwater treatment systems for improving their pathogen removal. And so we focused on plant selection, including what Penny Galbraith did, was looking at choosing antimicrobial producing plants to inactivate pathogens that were introduced into the biofilter. We had Yali Lee looking at different types of media and also antimicrobial coatings so that we could trap the microbes better and kill them more efficiently. And we had other people looking at how does retention time and storage zones influence the removal rates. But unfortunately, while the last decade and a half wasn't a waste, it still wasn't able to reduce the variability significantly over all of this research. So we saw an increase in the overall performance, but we didn't necessarily see a decrease in that variability that we saw over our monitoring periods. What we thought was that further optimization would need us to move beyond just optimizing the design of the biofilter or the wetland. Indeed, we hypothesized that we need to control these systems better. We need to create, instead of a passive system, this is the way they're traditionally designed, so when it rains, they drain with gravity. We need to kind of activate these systems. The simplicity of the passive systems is great, and we want to harness that when we activate them. But we feel if we wanted to improve their overall treatment performance, we needed to actively control them, and we want to do that in the most simplest way possible. So we had this young fella, Peng Fei Shen, and he worked on biofilters. He realized quite early that these operational conditions were really important. So the way in which the biofilter was operating was really important. It was really important in terms of their performance. If we could control these just slightly, then perhaps we could achieve a better pathogen reduction. And see, he focused on using cheap actuators, cheap sensors to retrofit these biofilters and use them to monitor the biofilters in real time and control them with very simple algorithms. Remembering, we're trying to harness the simplicity of these treatment systems that already exist. So we wanted low cost, simple to implement, easy to maintain, and easy to retrofit. We have no time to go through all of his results, but I'm going to take a minute just to explain one of his strategies. His real-time control strategy, number one, was very simple. He dictated that he wanted to ensure that water only ever entered the biofilter a maximum of every 12 hours. So what does this mean in reality? Well, all this means is that Peng Fei prevented water entering the system within a 12-hour period. So if water enters in the system at, let's say, 6 p.m. at night, the next allowable water that would go into that system would be 6 a.m. the next morning. And so it's a very short interval, I suppose you could say. And it only prevented those back-to-back events from injecting too much water into the biofilter. What we observed was that too much water going into the biofilter in consecutive events that occurred back-to-back within a 12-hour period meant that water was getting pushed through these systems too quickly, and it meant that the treatment performance deteriorated quite rapidly. We've got papers on this if you're interested, and we can talk more about that. These are just some of his laboratory work that he conducted. On the y-axis represents the E. coli concentrations. He injected some inflow concentrations into the system, and he monitored both the outlet of a normal system, so a passively operated system, and he monitored the outlet concentrations for the real-time controlled system. And as you can see, the difference in the outlet concentrations for the normal system versus the outlet concentration for the real-time controlled system is almost at what we call an order of magnitude. So the normal system was still getting around 90% removal of E. coli, which is fantastic. But with the real-time controlled system, we were able to increase that to beyond 99%, which is fantastic work. He conducted this over a long period of time, and I don't have time to go through all these details here, but basically to suggest that almost always those green bars, which were the real-time control bars, were lower on these plots than the red bars, which indicated real-time control was functioning well for these systems. So, real-time control on biofilters was working, but what about wetlands? We had another student called Shishi Shi who conducted real-time monitoring and control of wetlands in the laboratory. She can develop these wetlands, grew plants in them in a greenhouse, and outfitted them with lots of different sensors and control algorithms. She set up both real-time control wetlands and non-real-time control wetlands, i.e. passive systems, and compared how they performed. She also had lots of different strategies. I'm going to only focus on one today. The first strategy is what we call outlet closure. In this, water would come into the wetland. Upon initiation of that entering of that water, the outlet would be closed for 24 hours. After that rainfall event, after 24 hours, the outlet would be opened and would be drained more quickly so that the overall performance of the wetland was similar to a passively operated wetland. The performance of this system was also much improved compared to the passive or the non-RTC system. You can see the blue, this is E. coli, this microorganism that we use as an indicator for pathogens. You can see the blue box plot is much higher than the orange box plot. Again, roughly between 90% removal for a non-real-time control system. If we real-time controlled it using this very simple algorithm, we're able to boost that removal rate to greater than 99.5%. So that's a fantastic outcome. So this is great, but what happens if we're doing it in the field itself? So we've got Corrie and Camway both working on a wetland out in the southeast suburbs with Melbourne Water and Southeast Water as our industry partners and the Australian Government Research Council as our through the linkage program as also partners. And we're actuating this wetland at multiple points and outfitting this wetland with lots of sensors to see if we can mimic some of the results that Shishi was getting in the field. So in conclusion, low-cost sensors are being developed not just by us, but there's a huge movement around the world. So take a look at them if you're interested. We are focusing on low maintenance and non-contact sensing, and I think that's the future. Remember, the low cost does not necessarily mean low accuracy, and that's something that is kind of a myth in the field, I think. So I think we need to kind of debunk that. Real-time monitoring of urban water systems, it's a useful and cost-effective method of determining connections into the system. It has so much potential for monitoring of assets. So if you're interested in doing that and don't know where to start, feel free to reach out. Real-time control can help improve pathogen removal in stormwater biofilters and wetlands. And so we hope to be able to demonstrate this in the field and hopefully prove that this is a useful technology moving forward. So as I said, sensors, lots of being developed. We're focusing on a non-contact sensing type approach. And what we're hoping to do is develop enough information, guidelines and even models that help us to design new real-time control strategies for biofiltration systems and wetlands. If you're interested in real-time monitoring and control, there's lots of people doing it. I've just listed a few on this page. Feel free to go back to this page or reach out to me to contact any of these people, but you'll be hearing from Tim in just one moment. Wanted to last flag this concept of the IoT for Water Hub. So if you're interested in real-time monitoring or control of the of water systems, then please reach out to us. We've got a submission coming up in November. That would be a really nice collaboration if you're interested in this space. I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who have contributed to this presentation slideshow. I'd like to acknowledge the teams at Monash and QUT. I'd like to acknowledge Department of Health Victoria, Melbourne Water in particular, who've been a long-standing partner with us, Southeast Water, EPA Victoria, and of course the Australian Research Council. Thank you very much, and I'll be looking forward to some of your questions.
Thank you, David, for your input today. I would now like to welcome our second speaker, Professor Tim Fletcher. Tim is a Professor of Urban Ecohydrology at the University of Melbourne, based within the Waterway Ecosystem Research Group. He is internationally regarded for his expertise in waterway and stormwater management. His research focus includes urban hydrology, stormwater quality, and the design and performance of stormwater treatment and harvesting systems. Tim co-leads the Melbourne Waterway Research Practice Partnership between Melbourne Water and the University of Melbourne. In 2011, he received an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship, and in 2023 was awarded an ARC Industry Laureate Fellowship, working in partnership with Melbourne Water. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tim Fletcher.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Megan, for the introduction, and also thanks, David. I really enjoyed your presentation. We've heard a lot from David about the types of technologies that are now available to us, and I want to talk about how we can apply those to really transform the way we manage our urban water grids in particular. And so I'll talk about a particular application, which is the creation of smart rainwater grids, but we can imagine lots of other applications as well. So I'll start with a bit of context. We know that urbanisation changes everything about the way the water cycle works. Instead of getting lots of infiltration and lots of evapotranspiration and relatively small amounts of runoff, I say that as I watch some clouds go past me, we now have a situation in an urban state where we have lots and lots of runoff, very little, relatively little evapotranspiration, little infiltration, and so we change everything about what a stream experiences. Much more erosion, much more pollution, loss of habitat, loss of all the ecosystem services. And so if we look at just thinking about the flow regime for a second here, if we look at what happens to it, not only do we get this classic kind of well-known urban spikiness we see here, but we also get a loss of base flow. So on the left-hand side in our natural catchment, the black shows our base flow, and we see we've got quite sustained sort of base flow over this period. So this is some work that comes from Matthew Burns from the University of Melbourne. And we see here that we're losing that. That's being depleted. Not surprising because we have much less infiltration. And so the concept of water-sensitive urban design, which I'm sure you've heard of, tries to sort of use or mimic natural processes to restore more natural flow regimes and more natural water quality. So we try to cut off those peaks using things like harvesting and retention systems, promoting evapotranspiration, and we try to restore base flows if they have been lost by infiltration, irrigation, etc. So we use a whole range of components in the landscape to do that. And so we've all seen the type of things, wetlands, swales, rain gardens or bioretention systems, they're often called, and then stormwater harvesting, rainwater harvesting at a whole range of scales. And these all, look great, and there's lots of literature around showing that they work really well, but actually, and they do work well, but actually they have some pretty significant limitations too, which is that if we go into an urban area and try to encourage their uptake, we often find that that participation or uptake is pretty limited. I suppose because, people would say, well, what's in it for me? What am I getting out of it? We also find that systems like rainwater tanks, we tend to get fairly high malfunction rates because people don't do things like clean inlets or don't check that pumps are operating. And if it switches over to mains, we might not even know that it's malfunctioning. So yeah, they're still working, but not as well as they could as a global ensemble. And also these are by nature passive, meaning that if the tank is filled up and I haven't used much water today and it rains a lot tomorrow, the effectiveness of that tank, if it's full, in reducing peak flows downstream or reducing flood risk is going to be essentially zero, which is why often planning authorities are pretty reluctant to consider something like a rainwater tank as having a flood management function. Fair enough, because it's sort of uncertain. Now, you could argue we could account for that probabilistically, but nonetheless, the truth is it's uncertain. And as well as the systems themselves being passive, as I've described above, maybe the community participation or uptake of these systems is pretty passive, again, because they can't see a kind of long-term benefit. And not everyone's a stormwater nerd, as my family reminds me frequently. So I'm going to posit the theory that real-time control maybe offers us an interesting solution, not a silver bullet, but a solution to some of these problems by creating networks of stormwater control measures that are controlled in a kind of optimized way, controlled in a reactive way and a predictive way. We can not only make them perform better, but we can potentially offer those who own them a greater benefit, which is likely to be very central to their long-term uptake. So I'm going to draw on some work by a former PhD student of ours, Wei Daniel Xu, who looked at this concept of simply operating rainwater tanks in a real-time control way, where instead of just having them as a water supply system, having them operate in a way they still supply water, but they also empty themselves prior to a storm in order to mitigate against floods. And if we get our mathematics right, they do that in a way that's done in a very slow way, so we're getting a nice natural base flow. So rather than just releasing the day before or the hours before a storm, they're doing that over 7, 14, whatever days before. So they're doing it in a way that mimics very much the natural base flow, the type of thing that the stream ecosystem would be expecting if an ecosystem has expectations. There's an interesting philosophical debate. So basically what we're using for such a thing is a forecast, in this case through the Bureau of Meteorology's ADFD, Australian Digital Forecast Database, where we're getting twice a day forecasts over the next 7 days from the Bureau of Meteorology. Based on those predictions, we can make decisions about how much water should be released today, tomorrow, etc., to both contribute to that base flow and to reduce flood risks downstream. And in starting to develop these technologies, we spent quite a lot of work on trying to get the optimal forecast horizon and the optimal forecast strategies for operating these systems. And so, for example, if we know that in 6 days' time there's going to be a very large rainfall event, or at least we predict there's going to be, we could say, oh, well, let's release all this water today. But actually, if we think about it, we know that rainfall in 7 days or in 6 days is quite uncertain. It changes. The rainfall event might move slightly south, north, east, west. I think I've run out of directions. So that we might see, for our particular location, quite a substantial change. And so we worked on forecast strategies that said, for example, okay, if I need to release X litres in the next 7 days, I'm going to release X over 7 today. And then I'll look again tomorrow and see what's changed. Is the Bureau giving me a different forecast, etc.? So a classic kind of forecast window type approach. And importantly, we then started to say, okay, well, we think we've got a good model for that working. We're getting really good results using this 7-day forecast. Now let's see what benefits we can accrue by operating these tanks not as individual tanks optimizing their own behavior, but looking across the network and each tank being aware of each other tank. Again, interesting philosophy. Does a tank have an awareness? Anyway, and so what we can do there, for example, is have larger tanks being able to compensate for smaller tanks by saying, I'm going to release a bit more than I might otherwise do in order to compensate for the fact that my neighbour is really, really small and they don't have much to offer, or they're really, really empty or whatever. So we can start to get the classic benefits we get of a network being able to optimize across that network rather than individually. And so we then started to work with some colleagues in Quebec, in Canada, so Geneviève Pelletier and Sophie Duchesne, looking at whether we could reduce real flood risks in a catchment in Victoriaville, where there are significant flooding, whether we could achieve significant reductions in flood risk using this approach. So simple rainfall tanks, just dealing with the roof catchments. And so we combined swim with some code we'd written in R, and there are alternatives. There's a Python swim coupler called PySwim that does the same thing. And we see really quite substantial gains or substantial reductions in flood risk as a result of deployment of this relatively simple type of approach. So really quite encouraging. So we're starting to get a sense that actually this real-time control technologies has some pretty good potential for transforming the way we manage not only our stormwater system, but also in supplying a kind of water supply. So starting to think about some new hybrid approaches to water management. And so we've embarked most recently on an approach where we're working in Monbolt Creek out in the east of Melbourne. and combining these sort of small-scale storages with very large-scale storages, so big online lakes and retarding basins, etc., and operating that in a combined type of way. And we're interested in what benefits do we get for the flow regime? Can we achieve a better flow regime? What's the social sustainability of that? How do people interact with that? How does it change their awareness of water and their water practices? And importantly, in this case, we're interested in the impacts in stream, because in Monbulk Creek, we have a remnant platypus, or at least a threatened population of platypus, quite low numbers, something like 16 platypus, that are threatened by the changes to the flow regime, amongst other things they're threatened by, changes to flow regime from stormwater. And we hope to deploy this network in a way that optimizes the flow regime for the platypus, increases the amount of foraging habitat available for them, particularly during the peak season before breeding, where the female platypus really needs to get a lot of calories in, essentially, in order to prepare for breeding. And so what we're building here, so we're in the midst of building this, is a network of lots and lots of tanks, combined with these 3 big storages, so Birdsland Ponds 1 and 2 and Belgrave Lake, operating them all in a controlled way. And so we've written some control software called Mufasa and Timon. So Mufasa is the multi-user flow allocation simplified algorithm, and Timon is the time-optimized network. What this software essentially allows us to do is work out how much flow is needed at any one day, and then also to work out, depending on where you are in the catchment, at what time we make those releases in order to get a nice, the sort of target flow release. And we're doing that in a way that's informed by the environmental flow needs of the platypus in particular. So we're targeting the important flows for their foraging habitat in that pre-breeding period. And so while the mathematics of this are quite simple, what's perhaps most innovative about it is the way the IT side works. So in this case, the large storages are being controlled by Melbourne Water, and the Mufasa software sits on a Melbourne Water server. But all of the rainwater tanks operated by council and operated by individual households are actually operated by a piece of technology called Tank Talk, created by Southeast Water and IOTA. And basically the release requests, or the requests to those tanks, goes from Mufasa, so through Melbourne Water's server, through an application programming interface to Southeast Water's Tank Talk system, and then through their SCADA out to the individual tanks. So that, I think, is actually quite a good innovation. So 2 of these water authorities are combining their IT systems and their assets to get the result we want, which is really, really nice. And remembering, of course, that what this software does is looks at whether flows need to be released each day in order to provide the minimum required flow for platypus. And then at the same time, the Tank Talk algorithm already deals with the potential risk of flooding and will make decisions about whether releases need to be made from the flooding point of view. So they work seamlessly together. So one of the nice things about this is that we can really create for the users a sense of involvement. So those who own tanks, they are quite heavily involved in the decisions for how to operate them. So they have access to this user interface where they can see how full their tank is, what releases have been made from it, what inflows have gone into it. And importantly, they can make decisions about what amount of flow, or what proportion of the tank they're prepared to make available to us for releases. So some might be super environmentally motivated, and they say, oh, we're happy to provide 70% of our tank for you to use, and we'll keep 30% for our own use. Others might say, no, I want my 50%. That's the minimum. We have to have 50-50. And so the Mufasa algorithm respects that absolutely. When it calculates how much flow is to be released from each tank, it determines how much is needed and then how much is available in each tank and proratas the release according to the volume available in each tank. And this is really, really important because we're not just wanting the system to work well, but we're wanting to keep the owners of these tanks engaged because we're trying to test a new model where people are taking a much more active role in the management of water resources and their contribution to that management. So where to next? Where could we take this? We start to think that this has got quite a lot of potential. So I'm sure all of you will be aware of the concept of the solar panel and its connection through a smart grid type system where the solar panel is supplying electrons essentially, which I'm consuming in my own house, but the excess I have available goes into the grid, and for that I receive some financial compensation through a feed-in tariff. So inspired by that idea, we believe the same concept might be possible with a smart water grid like this, where we might be able to expect people to make contributions to a grid like this, so making environmental flow releases at times that they're required, by sending them a price signal. So essentially sending them on their little app that we write for them, details of an offer for today's release, and they can look at that and say, okay, if I make that release, I get X dollars. If I don't make that release and then I use that water in my house instead over the next week, 2 weeks or whatever, I save Y dollars. Which one am I interested in doing? And we think that this has the potential to open up a very exciting new future for the way we manage our water resources in urban areas, a hybrid between a centralized grid and a very decentralized system, just like we see in the electricity grid. And so I think real-time control is giving us access to a really quite exciting water future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Well, before we begin our Q&A today, I would like to acknowledge our international audience watching. I can see that we've got people who've dialed in from Hong Kong, Fiji and Sri Lanka. So hello, everyone. Well, as I said, it is our Q&A, so it's your turn to get involved in the webinar today. So please ask our speakers your questions via the chat box, and don't forget to include who your question is directed to. A big thank you to everyone who did submit questions while registering for the webinar today. So what I might do is begin with a couple of those questions. Tim. We've got a question that came through from Mohammed, who's in New South Wales. So, Tim, his question is a 100% accurate real-time calibration of a large water network model possible?
So calibration of large network models is not my absolute speciality, but in general terms, 100% calibration of any model is probably a bit too much to hope for. Having said that, I think we can increasingly expect really good calibrations, and particularly with a lot of the new machine learning tools that are available to us, we can start to get pretty accurate models. And I think actually David's presentation shows us a future now where we can afford to deploy lots of sensors in the network, and that really will reduce the uncertainty of these models because we can do calibration and validation at a whole lot of different points at low cost. So I think we can get much closer to 100% than we might have considered reasonable 10 years ago.
Thank you. Dave, I had a question for yourself, which came through from Sean Linestar. So big thank you to Sean for this question. It is, what is the best method of monitoring flow in pipes which are submerged? Oops, hopefully you'll be back with us shortly. Oh no.
Mm-hmm.
No, still on mute. I might throw to Tim with another question, if that's okay.
Right.
And was that Dave back with us? Nope. So Tim, you're it. I did have a question, and this one came through from registration, and it was from Andre, and it was with regards to, I suppose, if this technology or the sensors could actually be used or utilised as a flood early warning, so for, say, rail corridor or bridges.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Megan, and thanks for the question, Andre. Yeah, for sure. So again, the combination of now being able to put, level and velocity sensors in a cost-effective way in a whole lot of places in the network, and then to have, I would argue, not only warning systems but potentially flood management systems, where, for example, we start diverting flows or we open up detention basins and control those. There's a really great example of such a system in the city of Bordeaux in France called RAMSES, RAMSES, for anyone wanting to look it up. And it works really well to protect a whole lot of assets like rail assets, etc., from flooding of the Gironde River. So yeah, I would argue definitely. The question, of course, is who's going to invest in that, which flood management authority or rail management authority is going to do that. But yeah, certainly technically it's possible, more and more possible. And I would also argue that there's been huge improvements in real-time or now casting availables of rainfall based on artificial intelligence analysis of rainfall radar data. So we can also start to make predictions before we even start to see the flow based on those rainfall intensities that give us some clues about when, for example, we might need to, change things or to close a corridor, etc. So yeah, definitely possible. The missing ingredient is always the same. It's one of money, but low-cost sensors, etc., are starting to make this more and more possible.
No, that's really great to hear. Hopefully we have David back.
I haven't changed much, but can you hear me?
Yay, welcome.
Can hear me.
All right, now what was the question that I'd asked David? I can't remember.
It was about measuring
repeat it.
flows in submerged pipes. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Tim.
And it was from Sean, and he's actually just emailed me, so we're going to catch up. So I take the assumption that we're monitoring flow in pipes that are submerged in terms of full flow pipes. I think what we've used previously are mag flow meters, which work quite well. And we've also developed some quite small sensors that can stick on the outside of pipes that can measure the velocity within the pipe, the piping system, even through metal pipes. So there's lots of new technologies that can be installed for submerged pipe flow monitoring, which are still low cost, and most importantly, low cost in terms of installation costs. With the magflow meters, you need to cut a section of the pipe out and replace it with the magflow. With these other new technologies, it's a simple process of digging the pipe out and wrapping around a small sensing array that helps you measure the velocity of the water within the pipe itself. So thanks, Sean, and yes, we'll be in touch.
Perfect. Dave, a question did come through live from Eva, who's just posted, can we use these sensors to measure flow rate in underground pipes, especially water and wastewater?
Yes, definitely. So the benefit of some of the sensors that we're developing, a lot of low-cost sensors have been developed that only measure depth of water in pipes, and some people use a crude estimate or conversion of that depth of water to then estimate flow rate. We've done that before, and it works okay, but it's really missing the other key ingredient, which is measuring the velocity of the water as it flows. So with velocity plus the depth of the water and the pipe's geometry, you can really get a much better estimate of flow rates for water and wastewater systems. So yes, the answer is definitely yes, Diva. And if you're interested in maybe applying some of these lower cost sensors, please let us know. We're happy to help support you.
Thanks. Tim, I've got a question. Frankie has sent through a question, and it is, I love the use of cheap sensors and boards for monitoring. Were any investigations conducted on the use of more mechanical means for closed loop control, so buffer tanks, overflow systems, etc., rather than timed or feedback control actuators?
Yeah, so I might get Dave to respond as well, but yeah, we use a whole combination of sensors depending on what the situation is. For example, ones where electronics might not be appropriate, so we'll use a combination of mechanical closed loop type control systems, yeah, whole range of systems depending on the context. So again, I think there's lots of different things available. David's given a really good, I think, a really nice illustration of the sort of work that his group is doing at Bossel. But there are also lots of other, and actually David's got lots of contacts with a lot of manufacturers as well. So I think if you've got a particular application, then yes, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to put you in contact with anyone that might be able to provide exactly the thing you need.
Excellent. Well, I think Mahmood asked that specifically of you, Dave, with regards to where can we see these sensors in the application?
I don't know where you are located. Your location's not there, Mohammed. But yeah, you can just maybe perhaps reach out to either Tim or I. We both have lots of sensors around both Victoria and now Queensland. So if you're interested, just let us know. We've got contacts in all other Australian states as well. So if you want applications that are within your state and you're not in Victoria or Queensland, and please let us know. We've got other collaborators that have been developing their own sensors and applying them for their own use. So yes, reach out and we'll let you know. I just don't know where you're coming from. If you're in Victoria, reach out to Tim or I.
I had a live question come through from Katie Fletcher. So a big thank you to Katie for her question today. And it was, any thoughts on feasibility of changing design standards to go beyond nutrient, sediment and flood mitigation to consider pathogens, so platypus habitat and the many other factors not potentially discussed today? So I'm not quite sure who would like to take that one.
I perhaps can talk a little bit about the pathogens bit, but then it's perfect that Tim's here. He can then talk about the platypus section. And maybe we'll just today focus on those two, Katie, if that's okay. Thanks for your question, Katie. Yes, we in our small stormwater world have been working quite hard to change the way in which we design our stormwater treatment infrastructure to go beyond nutrients and sediment. And in fact, your question probably means that the last kind of 10, 15 years of my research hasn't been hasn't done its job in terms of getting it out into the water networks. But we've been trying over the last 10 to 15 years to try to improve design so that we can not just treat nutrients, sediments, heavy metals, but also optimize these systems for pathogen removal. And so we've designed new plant species, what type of plants to be planting in biofiltration systems and wetlands, all the way down to what type of media systems we should be installing. Can we coat them with antimicrobial compounds to inactivate those microbes? And then finally, I feel like the most bang for buck now is actually how we control these systems in the future, and whether we can control them well enough to achieve much more significant pathogen reductions. So moving on just from design, but also how do we design and control them operationally in the future so that they're not just passive, they're also active systems. But Tim, do you want to talk about the platypus?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And it's a really great question, Katie. And I'm not just saying that because we might end up being cousins or something. I think similar point to Dave. I feel like most of my career has been spent trying to advocate for standards that are a little bit more nuanced and a bit more focused on the environmental needs. And I say this with some sense of not guilt, but a little bit of distress, actually, because I was one of the authors of the original nutrient sediment targets that are now deployed across Australia, sort of in a very blanket way, all the way back in 1996. And they've sort of survived without a lot of improvement, which is a bit depressing, really. And it says a lot less about the science, because the science has definitely moved on a long, long way. And much more about the political process, how difficult it is to get change. In Victoria, which is the jurisdiction I know the best in Australia at least, there's been, I think, at least 3 serious attempts to change the targets, and they've all kind of progressed very nicely, and David's been involved in, I think, at least 2 of these as well. And then fallen over at the regulatory impact statement stage, or fallen over at the election stage, essentially. So I think a big step forward in Victoria has been the new Environment Protection Act, which was in 2022, I think, that has a general environmental duty attached to it, and now has guidelines. So I'll come back to that word, an important word, guidelines around broader aspects of flow management, stormwater management, how much flow should be infiltrated in order to sustain a base flow in the catchment. So that's indirectly about things like platypus, not just platypus, but and how much water should be harvested in order to not have excess flows. And so that's coming from the kind of environmental or receiving stream perspective. Those are just guidelines. They're not yet standards, but I would think that the likely direction is that they become standards. And at that time, when there's the next move to get those into standards, then we need to be bringing all of these together. So it's great to get the receiving water stuff right for platypus and fish, etc., but we should be getting the pathogen stuff right at the same time, because every time we make a change, it's going to be many, many years before we make another change, just because of the political process. So if we ignore pathogens on the year we fix up receiving water standards, for example, we won't 6 months later go back and fix pathogens. So people like Dave and I will keep pushing to ensure that our standards improve to meet the needs of humans and receiving waters. It's a really important question you raise, because the current standards, they were a start in 1996, but boy, a lot of time has gone by since.
Great question from Katie. I have another question which has come through live from Stacey. So, hi Stacey. It is. So these sensors in the field are Internet of Things devices. What protocol has been used by SCADA to interrogate, if I can get my words out, the field sensors? So potentially Tim?
Yes, I can talk. Dave might have a perspective on this as well. This is really depends on the organisation's policies rather than something we're developing. So, for example, in Southeast Water, their tank talk technology, so we deploy our Mufasa and Timon algorithm through their established tank talk system, and that makes its calls through SCADA, so it's embedded within SCADA. So we are connecting into that through a secured API, and then those calls go, those release calls go out through their existing SCADA setup for tank talk. Let's take the other extreme. In our current arrangement with Melbourne Water, where we're controlling much bigger storages, so the risks are high, they refuse to let our IoT systems be ingested into SCADA, or even though we can think of technical ways of solving that. So it's outside of the SCADA network, obviously, and they won't let us, they won't let SCADA ingest that. And so the way we do it is to send a simultaneous email and text to the SCADA operators to make, or the system operators to make adjustments to valves. That's a way around it. It's one that I very much dislike, I'll confess, because it's mathematically impure for a person like me. So I write nice algorithms to do lovely feathering iteration the same way you'd write for, autopiloting a plane. So it wasn't very kind of clunky in its operation. So I try to do the same things, thinking about, the mathematical feathering of it. But you can't do that if there's a human at the end of chain, because they do not want to be turning a valve by, 1 degree every day, do they? So we're looking at some options, which I don't think I want to describe here, but some options that would allow us to use the automation of SCADA, but to in no way undermine the existing security arrangements. So it's definitely an issue, because the security of SCADA is sacrosanct, of course, and we need to make sure we never compromise on that, despite how inconvenienced we might feel. Dave, I don't know whether you've got other perspectives.
No, I think you've covered most of them. I would just say that, there is and indeed a risk of security and protecting data streams. I do think that it has differed depending on the organisation that we've worked with. But at the moment, the way in which we do our real-time control is and real-time monitoring is via 3G, 4G, and mainly NB-IoT networks, allowing us to have secure streams of data between our web server and localized data loggers that are on site, and that remains very secure.
Thanks, Dave. Didn't have a question that has come through from Shirley Rose, and she's directed it to yourself, Dave. How well do you think these small, low-cost sensors fare if they were to monitor channels that only flow in rare rainfall events? How long do the sensors last? Are they robust enough?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Shirley Rose. I appreciate your comment. It's a common question for what we call low-cost sensors. Many people believe that low cost equals less robust and less accurate. And I suppose one of our ideas of setting up this these small research teams is to kind of, I suppose, challenge those arguments and perhaps push the boundaries of how well these low cost sensors can perform. I think in general, we try our best indeed to ensure that they are as robust as possible. We find that actually the things that destroy commercial sensors are the same things that destroy our low-cost sensors. Things like vandalism is a huge one, and that doesn't matter if you've got a $5,000 instrument or a $50 equivalent low-cost sensor. It's always going to happen. Really large rainfall events that have the capacity to rip sensors from their housings or rip cords accordingly will also occur for a low-cost sensor versus a more commercially supplied sensor or sensing system. So, our experience is that just because they're low cost doesn't necessarily mean they're less robust. We have explored the use of sensors in systems that do dry up, and we've had some really good successes there, where there is this channel that in what we call Troops Creek wetland, where the channel bed actually dries up and the sensors are out of water for a number of days, perhaps even weeks. And so that's occurred. We have had good experiences so far, but we've also had some experiences over in California where we've deployed them, where in fact one of our turbidity sensors needed to be replaced because of this extreme fluctuation in heat. But that was quite an extreme event. It was out there for many months in dry weather. It certainly wasn't a Melbourne-like installation where we received rainfall more consistently. So yeah, that's. I don't know if I can specifically answer your question, but I can certainly give you some more data, Shirley Rose, if you've got some more specific questions later on.
Thank you. Look, we are running out of time, so I might go to our final question, and it was one which kind of came through a little bit with the registration questions around the real-time monitoring and the control of water systems. Is it state-specific, or is there potentially a national approach? So I'm not quite sure who might want to comment on that one, or if you both do, and this will be our final question for today. Tim.
Oh, yeah, so that's a really good question, I think, and it's a nice one to finish on too. I think both Dave and I have some concerns a little bit when we go around seeing that, of course, everyone's trying to do things. We're in a period of really great transformation, or great transition, where digital technologies are, very quickly becoming available, and there's a risk of a lot of waste investment because everyone's trying to solve the same problem. And there's also the classic beta VHS risk as well, that people will develop different standards. So David and I are both involved in a proposal to the Australian Research Council for an industry transformation hub. And it's got some research ambitions, but as much as anything, it's got some ambitions to create a community of practice around IoT for the water industry, so that the researchers and the industry within itself can share a sort of common language, a common understanding. And just as an example, I was talking to one of the regional water authorities in Victoria yesterday, and they said, yeah, we're pretty keen on joining this as much as anything, so we can just talk to other big authorities who are maybe a bit less cash-strapped than us, find out what they've already done so we can implement their solutions rather than having to invest a whole lot of money in finding the right solution for us. So yeah, I think a really good point. There's a risk of it being sort of state and jurisdiction based, but we hope, both ourselves and with a whole lot of our colleagues who are leading this transformation hub proposal, that we can create a national community of practice to avoid that sort of duplication.
Awesome. Perfect. Dave, did you want to add anything to that answer, or?
No, that was perfect. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone.
All right, well, look, that's all the time that we have for today. So please join me in once again thanking our speakers, Professor David McCarthy and Professor Tim Fletcher, for their time and input. I would also like to thank Engineers Australia's industry partner, QUT, for their support. And if I could please ask you, our audience, to complete the short feedback form, which is linked in the description box below. It really does help us to improve and plan for future sessions. If you could do that, would be wonderful. So finally, thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next Thought Leaders event. Good afternoon.